Why you'll never feel good enough until you learn this. Have you ever wondered why no matter how much you achieve, accomplish, improve, or perfect, there's always a voice inside saying, it's not enough? You get the promotion, the degree, the approval, the recognition, you finally reach the milestone you believed would silence that voice, and somehow it grows louder. It's almost as if the feeling of not being enough has nothing to do with what you do, but with something far more hidden, far more uncomfortable, what you believe you are. And that's where this journey starts. Because today we're diving into a truth most people never discover, a truth that shapes your entire life without you noticing. You'll never feel good enough until you understand the thing you're trying to be enough for. Imagine you're running a race you didn't choose, wearing shoes that don't fit, chasing a finish line that keeps moving every time you get close. That is the experience of inadequacy. That is why you always feel behind, even when you're ahead. You're not failing the race, you're running the wrong one, and the world never taught you how to stop. So you keep sprinting, hoping the next achievement will give you peace. But peace built on performance is a house built on sand. It collapses the second the applause fades. Now let's ask the first deep question, a question I promise will linger long after this video ends. Who told you that your worth must be earned? This question is the philosophical earthquake that shakes the foundation of your insecurity, because nobody is born feeling insufficient. Watch a child, they don't doubt their value. They don't second guess whether they're allowed to be loud, curious, messy, expressive, imperfect. They simply are. So what happened to you? When did you learn that being yourself wasn't enough?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Here's the accelerated philosophical progression. In childhood, we discover that approval equals safety. A smile from a parent means acceptance. A frown means rejection. Praise means belonging. Criticism means distance. Why does this matter? Because the mind of a child is literal, it absorbs patterns, not intentions. So even if you had loving parents, you probably still learned the most harmful belief of all. I must be a certain way to be loved. And once that belief forms, feeling enough becomes impossible. Because love becomes conditional. Worth becomes conditional. Your existence becomes conditional. And this sets up the greatest illusion of adulthood, the illusion that if you optimize yourself perfectly, you'll finally win unconditional love. But perfection is infinite. Conditions are endless. Standards evolve. So you keep climbing a ladder that has no top. Alan Watts once said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. And that's what you've been doing, trying to create an identity worthy of the love you were already born deserving of. Now let's bring the viewer back in with a striking realization. Every insecurity you have is a story someone else wrote and handed to you before you were old enough to question it. Think about that. Every time you doubt yourself, every time you feel behind, every time you compare yourself, it's because someone conditioned you to measure your worth externally. But here's the conflict. The external world is unstable, unpredictable, inconsistent. So when you build your worth on it, you become unstable, unpredictable, inconsistent. No wonder you never feel good enough, your metric keeps changing. Here comes the mid-video intensity. Want to know the real reason you feel insufficient? It's not because you're lacking. It's because you've been taught to judge yourself through standards that weren't designed for humans, they were designed for systems. Schools measure performance. Workplaces measure efficiency. Social media measures attention. Society measures conformity. None of these frameworks were created to measure you, yet you let them define you. Isn't that insane? Imagine taking a fish, a bird, and a tiger and measuring them using the same criteria. The fish can't fly. The tiger can't swim like a fish. The bird can't roar. So all of them would conclude they're not enough. But the problem isn't them, it's the metric. And here's the twist. You've spent your entire life letting the wrong metrics tell you who you are. We hit the second re-engagement moment now, the true philosophical punch. You don't feel good enough because you've forgotten something essential. Your worth doesn't increase when you succeed, and it doesn't decrease when you fail. It simply is. But you've been living as if your worth is a currency rather than a birthright. So let me ask you another deep question, the kind that stops your mind cold. If worth wasn't a scoreboard, who would you become? Seriously. Who would you be if you stopped living as a contestant and started living as a consciousness? A presence? A being? Because in the next part, we're going deeper not into what makes you feel unworthy, but why the feeling survives, why it doesn't go away even when you achieve more, and how your brain traps you in a loop that no accomplishment can solve. The endless loop of not enough and the hidden part of you that keeps feeding it. Here's where the story gets darker, deeper, and more revealing, because feeling not enough isn't just a belief. It's a cycle, a self-reinforcing psychological loop, a pattern carved so deeply into your identity that you mistake it for truth. And the most shocking part, it continues not because the world tells you you're inadequate, but because a part of you believes you must remain inadequate to stay safe. That sounds absurd, right? But once you understand this, everything changes. Because the insecurity you've been trying to fix through achievement can't be fixed by achievement. It wasn't built by achievement. It was built by fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of irrelevance, fear of losing love. And fear can't be solved with trophies, praise, or validation. Fear dissolves only when you understand it. Let's go back to childhood, not to blame anyone but to decode the root. When you were young, your brain learned patterns that felt like survival. Maybe you were celebrated only when you did well. Maybe you were ignored unless you impressed. Maybe you were compared to siblings, rewarded for obedience, or punished for imperfection. Without knowing it, you built an identity around effort. You built a self-image around achievement. You learned that acceptance is conditional and therefore unpredictable. So to feel safe, you created a rule. If I'm always improving, no one can abandon me. That rule protected you. But now, as an adult, it enslaves you. This sets up a paradox. Your mind chases achievement not to feel worthy, but to avoid the terror of feeling worthless. So no matter how much you accomplish, the feeling of not enough returns. You hit a goal, then the next. You impress someone, then need to impress them again. You get validation, and it fades. It's like drinking salt water, momentarily satisfying, ultimately dehydrating. And you keep drinking it because your brain whispers, more will fix it. But more never fixes it, because you're trying to fill a void with things that cannot fill voids. Here comes the philosophical hook. The self you're trying to improve is not the self that feels unworthy. The insecure self is a younger version of you, a psychological fragment frozen in time, still believing you need to earn love to deserve existence. That younger self wakes up every time you compare yourself, every time you feel behind, every time someone disapproves of you. And here's the twist you didn't expect. You cannot heal the feeling of not being enough by becoming more. You heal it by becoming aware. Awareness dissolves illusions, and not enough is the greatest illusion of all. Alan Watts once said, "You are an aperture through which the universe looks at itself," meaning, your worth is inherent because you are existence expressing itself, not graded, not ranked, not measured, simply alive. But you live as if you're a product on a shelf waiting for someone to assign value. You try to impress the world, forgetting that the world doesn't have a unified consciousness capable of approving you. It's just people. And most people aren't even paying attention. They're too busy feeling inadequate themselves. Imagine there's a scoreboard above your head displaying your worth. You keep checking it after every accomplishment, job, relationship, money, follower count. Sometimes the number spikes, but it always drops again. You don't realize that the scoreboard isn't real. It's not connected to anything true. It's a projection of your insecurity. The more you stare at it, the more real it feels. But if you stop looking, it disappears. The loop of not enough continues because you've attached your identity to a self that will never be satisfied. This self is addicted to progress, terrified of stagnation, allergic to imperfection. This self is obsessed with becoming. But Watts taught that the pursuit of becoming replaces the joy of being. You're so focused on becoming enough tomorrow that you cannot feel whole today. And here is the deep question that shatters the loop. What if there is no version of you, past, present, or future, that is more worthy than you are right now? If that question feels impossible to accept, that's the point. Your mind has confused worth with performance for so long that unconditional worth feels foreign, even dangerous. If you stop striving, will you become lazy, irrelevant, unimportant, useless? That fear exposes the truth. You are terrified of what exists inside you when you stop proving yourself. But peace, real peace, comes only when you stop treating your life like an audition for approval that was never required. Because in the next part, we go even deeper. We uncover the real enemy behind the feeling of not being enough. The false self you built, the identity you perform, and the expectations you inherited. And then we reveal the one thing you must learn to finally break free. The false identity you built to survive. And the truth that finally sets you free. Here's the part most people never see. The part that hides beneath the surface of every insecurity, every doubt, every comparison, every moment you feel like you don't measure up. The version of you that feels not enough is not the real you. It's a mask and identity built from expectations, survival strategies, and borrowed beliefs. And you've worn that mask for so long that you've mistaken it for your face. But Alan Watts would remind us that the ego is not the self, it's the costume the self puts on to navigate society. The problem isn't that you don't feel good enough. The problem is that the version of you trying to feel good enough was never meant to carry the weight of your entire existence. It's a role, not a soul. A persona, not a presence. And here's the devastating realization. No amount of success will ever make a false identity feel enough, because the identity itself was built from inadequacy. Let's dissect this. You developed a performer self to survive. You learned which traits got you love, which got you attention, which got you approval. You learned to be smart, or funny, or quiet, or agreeable, or hardworking, or self-sacrificing, not because these traits were always natural, but because they were rewarded. Slowly, you built a character optimized for acceptance. But here's the philosophical trap. Once you become a character, you can no longer experience love directly. You only experience love through the mask. And that means every compliment, every achievement, every bit of validation feels hollow because deep inside, the real you whispers, "They're not praising me, they're praising my mask." That is why you never feel enough. How could you? You aren't being seen. Now let's take this deeper. The false self you constructed operates like a machine with one mission: maintain approval at all costs. That mission drives everything: your work ethic, your perfectionism, your social anxiety, your fear of failure, your overthinking. This false self believes the world is watching, judging, scoring. It believes you must earn your space in the world. But the real you, the consciousness beneath the identity, doesn't care about any of that. It wants to breathe. It wants to breathe. It wants to exist without having to justify that existence. So the conflict between your real self and your performer self becomes a lifelong war. And nothing disrupts inner peace more than an internal war. Here's a shock moment. You have been trying to heal insecurity by upgrading the false self instead of dismantling it. Think about it. When you feel inadequate, you don't question the identity, you try to make it better. You think, if I just improve, they will finally approve. But approval is not the same as worth. Approval is a reaction from outside. Worth is a truth from inside. Trying to fix insecurity by chasing approval is like trying to put out a fire by adding more fuel. The flame grows. The emptiness expands. The feeling of not enough intensifies, because you're feeding the very identity that was built from inadequacy. Let's introduce the second profound realization, the one that shifts everything. You don't need to become more to feel enough. You need to become less attached to the persona, less attached to expectations, less attached to who you think you must be. When you strip away the layers of performance, something incredible happens. You stop measuring yourself. You stop performing yourself. You stop chasing versions of yourself. And in that stillness, the real self emerges, a self that doesn't need to be enough because it simply is. Alan Watts used to say that the self is like a wave on the ocean. You are not separate, not isolated, not defective. You are part of the same consciousness that breathes life into everything. Waves don't ask whether they're enough. They don't compare themselves to other waves. They don't strive to be taller or stronger. They rise because rising is natural. They fall because falling is natural. And they never doubt their place in the ocean because they are the ocean, expressed momentarily in form. So here's the radical truth, the truth your ego resists because it cannot survive it. You already are what you're trying to become. Every spiritual tradition, every deep philosophical teaching, every enlightened master echoes the same message. The search for worthiness ends the moment you realize you were never unworthy. But the journey isn't done. Because if you want to finally break free, if you want to stop chasing worth and start living it, there is one final thing you must learn. One shift so powerful that it dissolves the entire illusion of inadequacy at its root. And that is what we explore in the final part, the ultimate revelation that explains why you'll never feel good enough until you understand the true nature of identity, desire, and freedom. The moment you stop chasing worth and start becoming whole, there comes a moment in life, quiet, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when you begin to sense that the battle you're fighting is no longer with the world, but with yourself. You start to realize that the feeling of not enough doesn't come from failure or lack or imperfection. It comes from misunderstanding what you truly are. All your life, you've believed that worth is something you climb toward, something earned through accomplishment or approval. But what if worthiness was never a mountain at all? What if it was the ground you've been standing on this whole time? And what if the endless climb is the very thing hiding that truth from you? This is the final revelation, the moment where everything clicks into place. You will never feel good enough because enough is a concept created by the ego, not a condition of the soul. The ego measures. The soul experiences. The ego compares. The soul expresses. The ego fears. The soul simply is. And as long as you are trying to satisfy the ego with achievements, validation, perfection, or superiority, you will always feel inadequate. Not because you lack something, but because the ego cannot be satisfied. It is built to hunger. Let's go deeper. The ego's job is survival through identification, through defining itself against everything else. It says, I am this, not that. I am worthy if I achieve. I am valuable if I'm loved. I am important if I succeed. But identity built on comparison is unstable by design. Today you feel confident because you look good. Tomorrow you feel insecure because someone looks better. Today you feel proud of your accomplishments. Tomorrow you feel behind because someone did more. This inner turbulence is not a flaw. It is the nature of an ego-made identity. The ego is a measuring tool. It can do nothing but measure. And what happens when you measure yourself constantly? You become an object in your own eyes, something to be improved, optimized, perfected, judged. You forget that you are not an object. You are a consciousness experiencing existence, a living awareness, not a product needing upgrades. This is the heart of every insecurity. You abandon your being to perform an identity. Now comes the turning point. The soul, the deeper self, does not ask to be enough. It does not compare itself to others. It does not pursue worth. It simply unfolds. Just as a flower never questions whether it is blooming correctly, the soul does not question whether it is valuable. It knows. Your soul is the part of you that feels peace when you stop trying. The part of you that knows joy without reason. The part that feels whole without validation. But you rarely hear it, because the ego is always shouting over it. So what is the thing you must learn? What is the truth that finally dissolves inadequacy at its root? It is this: worth is not something you achieve. It is something you remember. Your worth is inherent, unconditional, unearned, and indestructible. But somewhere along the way, you were taught to forget it. You were taught a language of judgment instead of acceptance. You were taught to see yourself as a task instead of a being. You were taught to seek outside what already lives inside. This brings us to a deeper, almost spiritual insight. The feeling of not being enough is not a flaw. It is a sign you've been living from the wrong identity. The ego fears imperfection because its survival depends on maintaining its image. But the soul embraces imperfection because it understands that growth is natural, not shameful. The ego demands applause, the soul delights in presence. The ego wants to be admired, the soul wants to be free. So reflect on this. Who is living your life right now, the ego or the soul? The one that measures or the one that experiences? The one that fears or the one that embraces? The one that performs or the one that simply exists? The truth is, you will never feel good enough as long as you live as a character designed to earn acceptance. That character is fragile, temporary, anxious, and needy. But the awareness beneath it, the one watching the thoughts, the one feeling the emotions, the one hearing these words, that is already whole. What happens when you stop trying to become enough and start recognizing that you already are? Something extraordinary. The constant striving quiets. The comparison fades. The fear loosens. The pressure dissolves. You return to your natural state, the state of being, not becoming. And that is the moment life begins again. Not as a race, not as a performance, not as a struggle to prove yourself, but as an unfolding expression of the self that was never broken, never lacking, never unworthy. You'll never feel good enough until you learn this. You are never meant to chase your worth, you are meant to live from it.